We're going to be listening to Sleepy Hollow. Sleepy Hollow.
The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. In the bosom of one of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson north of the island of Manhattan lies a small market town known by the name of Tarrytown. Not far from this village there is a little valley among high hills which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it with just murmur enough to lull one to sleep, and the occasional whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker are almost the only sounds that ever break in upon the uniform tranquility. This sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land and to pervade the very atmosphere. Some say the place was bewitched and under the sway of some power that holds a spell over the minds of the good people. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs, are subject to trances and visions, and frequently see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. And seeming to be commander-in-chief of all powers of the air is the apparition of a figure on horseback without a head. It is said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War. It is said that the body of the trooper, having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth to the scene of battle in nightly quest of his head. Such is the general purport of this legendary superstition, known by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. In this place lived a worthy wight of the name of Ichabod Crane, who sojourned, or as he expressed it, tarried in Sleepy Hollow for the purpose of instructing the children of the vicinity. He was tall and lanky, with long arms and legs, feet that might have served for shovels. His head was small and flat at top, with huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long snip nose. One might have mistaken him for the genius of famine descending upon the earth, or some scarecrow eloped from a cornfield. Ichabod was a conscientious schoolmaster. His earnings were small, so he boarded and lodged at the houses of the farmers whose children he instructed. With these he lived successively a week at a time, going the rounds of the neighborhood with all his worldly effects tied up in a cotton handkerchief. He was the singing master of the neighborhood and picked up extra income by instructing the young folks in psalmody. Among the musical students who assembled one evening each week to receive his singing instructions was Katrina Van Tassel, the daughter and only child of a substantial Dutch farmer. She was a blooming lass of fresh 18, plump as a partridge, ripe and melting and rosy-cheeked as one of her father's peaches, and universally famed not merely for her beauty, but her vast expectations. Ichabod Crane had a soft and foolish heart towards the opposite sex, so Katrina, a tempting morsel, soon found favor in his eyes. More especially after he had visited her home, for her father, old Baltus Van Tassel, was wealthy. From the moment Ichabod laid his eyes upon this wealth, the peace of his mind was at an end, and his only thought was how to gain the affections of the peerless daughter of Van Tassel. In this enterprise, however, he had difficulties. Ichabod had to win her heart against a host of fearful adversaries who beset every portal to her heart. Among these, the most formidable was a burly, roaring, roistering blade of the name of Abraham, or according to the Dutch abbreviation, Brom Van Brunt, the hero of the country round. He was broad-shouldered and double-jointed, with short, curly black hair and a bluff but not unpleasant countenance, having a mingled air of fun and arrogance. From his Herculean frame and great powers of limb, he had received the nickname of Brom Bones, by which he was universally known. He was famed for great knowledge and skill in horsemanship, being as dexterous on horseback as a Tartar. He was always ready for either a fight or a frolic, and with all his overbearing roughness, there was a strong dash of waggish good humor at bottom. Such was the formidable rival whom Ichabod Crane had to contend. To have fought openly against his rival would have been madness, for he was not a man to be thwarted in his amours any more than that stormy lover Achilles. Ichabod, therefore, made his advances in a quiet and gently insinuating manner. Under cover of his character of singing master, he made frequent visits at the farmhouse. From the moment Ichabod Crane made his advances on Katrina, her interest in Brom Bones evidently declined. Brom's horse was no longer seen tied at her home on Sunday nights, and a deadly feud gradually arose between Ichabod and the Brom Bones. Ichabod was well aware of Brom's superior might. He had overheard a boast of Bones that he would double the schoolmaster up and lay him on a shelf of his own schoolhouse, and he was too wary to give him an opportunity. So Brom soon began to perform pranks around the schoolhouse. On a fine autumnal afternoon, Ichabod was sent an invitation to attend a merrymaking that evening at Mynheer Van Tassel's. The gallant Ichabod spent at least an extra half hour at his toilet, brushing and furbishing up his best. He borrowed a broken-down old plow horse named Gunpowder from the farmer with whom he was living. The sky was clear and serene as Ichabod made his way. The forests had put on their sober brown and yellow of the season. Streaming files of wild ducks began to make their appearance high in the air. The bark of the squirrel might be heard from the groves of beech and hickory nuts, and the pensive whistle of the quail at intervals from the neighboring stubble field. It was towards evening that Ichabod arrived at the castle of Herr Van Tassel. Brom Bones, however, was the hero of the scene, having come to the gathering on his favorite steed, Daredevil, a creature like himself, full of mettle and mischief, and which no one but himself could manage. Ichabod entered the party with all its delicacies, cakes and pies, hams and beef. Happily, Ichabod was not in a hurry, and did ample justice to every dainty. Old Baltus Van Tassel moved about among his guests with a face dilated with content and good humor, round and jolly as the harvest moon. The sound of the music from the common room summoned people to dance. Ichabod prided himself upon his dancing as much as upon his vocal powers. Not a limb, not a fiber about him was idle. The lady of his heart was his partner in the dance, and smiling graciously in reply to all his amorous oglings, while Brom Bones, sorely smitten with love and jealousy, sat brooding by himself in one corner. When the dance was at end, Ichabod was attracted to a group of folks gossiping over former times and drawing out long stories about the war. But all these were nothing to the tales of ghosts and apparitions that succeeded. Several of the Sleepy Hollow people were present, and as usual were doling out their wild and wonderful legends. Many dismal tales were told about funeral trains and mourning cries and wailings heard and seen about the great tree where the unfortunate Major Andre was taken, and which stood in their neighborhood. The chief part of the stories, however, turned upon the favorite specter of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman, who had been heard several times of late patrolling the country. The tale was told of old Brower, how he met the horseman returning from his trip into Sleepy Hollow, how they galloped over bush and brake, over hill and swamp, until they reached the bridge, when the horseman suddenly turned into a skeleton, threw old Brower into the brook, and sprang away. The story was immediately matched by a thrice marvelous adventure of Brom Bones, who made light of the galloping Hessian as an arrant jockey. All these tales told in that drowsy undertone with which men talk in the dark, the countenances of the listeners only now and then receiving a casual gleam from the glare of a pipe, sank deep in the mind of Ichabod, who didn't care for them. The party ended, and Ichabod lingered behind to have a tete-a-tete with the heiress, fully convinced that he was now on the high road to success. But something went wrong between the two, and Ichabod was quickly and unhappily on his way. It was the very witching time of night that Ichabod traveled home. The hour was as dismal as himself. All the stories of ghosts and goblins that he had heard in the afternoon now came crowding upon his recollection. He had never felt so lonely and dismal. In the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree, towering like a giant with gnarled limbs large enough to form trunks for ordinary trees. As Ichabod approached this fearful tree, he began to whistle. He thought his whistle was answered. It was but a blast sweeping sharply through the dry branches. Suddenly, he heard a groan. His teeth chattered, and his knees smote against the saddle. It was but the rubbing of one huge bough upon another as they were swayed about by the breeze. He passed the tree in safety, but new perils lay before him. About 200 yards from the tree, a small brook crossed the road. A few rough logs laid side by side served for a bridge over the stream. To pass this bridge was the severest trial. This is considered a haunted stream. As he approached, his heart began to thump, and he gave his horse half a score of kicks in the ribs and attempted to dash briskly across the bridge. But instead of starting forward, the old animal went to the side. Ichabod, whose fears increased with the delay, jerked the reins on the other side, but the horse only turned to the opposite side. Then he whipped old Gunpowder, who finally dashed forward, but stopped just by the bridge with a suddenness that had nearly sent Ichabod over his horse's head. Suddenly, a plashy tramp by the side of the bridge caught the sensitive ear of Ichabod. In the dark shadow of the grove on the margin of the brook, he saw something huge, misshapen, black, and towering. It stirred not, but seemed gathered up into the gloom like some gigantic monster ready to spring upon the traveler. The hair of the affrighted pedagogue rose upon his head with terror. What was to be done? To turn and fly was now too late, and besides, what chance was there of escaping ghost or goblin? Summoning up, therefore, a show of courage, he demanded in stammering accents, "Who are you?" He received no reply. He repeated his demand. Just then, the shadowy object of alarm put itself in motion. He appeared to be a horseman of large dimensions and mounted on a black horse of powerful frame. Ichabod now quickened his steed. The stranger quickened to an equal pace. Ichabod pulled up. The stranger did the same. His heart began to sink within him. There was something in the moody and dogged silence of this pertinacious companion that was mysterious and appalling. It was soon fearfully accounted for. On mounting a rising ground, which brought the figure of his fellow traveler in relief against the sky, gigantic in height and muffled in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless. But his horror was still more increased on observing that the head, which should have rested on his shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of the saddle. His terror rose to desperation. He rained a shower of kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping by a sudden movement to give his companion the slip. But the specter started full jump with him. Away then they dashed through thick and thin, stones flying and sparks flashing at every bound. They reached the road which turns off to Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder made an opposite turn and plunged headlong downhill to the left on the road leading to the bridge in the famous Goblin story. Just as he had got halfway through the hollow, the girths of the saddle gave way, and he felt it slipping from under him. He seized it by the pommel and endeavored to hold it firm, but in vain, and had just time to save himself by clasping old Gunpowder round the neck when the saddle fell to the earth, and he heard it trampled underfoot by his pursuer. An opening in the trees now cheered him with the hopes that the church bridge was at hand. He saw the walls of the church dimly glaring under the trees beyond. "If I can but reach that bridge," thought Ichabod, "I am safe." Just then he heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him. He even fancied that he felt his hot breath. Another convulsive kick in the ribs, and old Gunpowder sprang upon the bridge. He thundered over the resounding planks. He gained the opposite side, and now Ichabod cast a look behind to see if his pursuer should vanish according to rule in a flash of fire and brimstone. Just then he saw the goblin rising in his stirrups, and in the very act of hurling his head at him. Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, but too late. It encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash. He was tumbled headlong into the dust, and Gunpowder, the black steed, and the goblin rider passed by like a whirlwind. The next morning, the old horse was found, but Ichabod did not make his appearance. An inquiry was set on foot, and after diligent investigation, they came upon his traces. In one part of the road was found the saddle trampled in the dirt and tracks of horses. On the bank of the brook was found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside it, a shattered pumpkin. The mysterious event caused much speculation. It is true an old farmer who had been down to New York on a visit several years after brought home information that Ichabod Crane was still alive and that he had left the neighborhood, partly through fear of the goblin and partly in mortification at having been suddenly dismissed by the heiress, and that he had changed his quarters to a distant part of the country. Shortly after his rival's disappearance, Brom Bones conducted the blooming Katrina in triumph to the altar, and was observed to look exceedingly knowing whenever the story of Ichabod was related, and always burst into a hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, which led some to suspect that he knew more about the matter than he chose to tell. The old country wives, however, who are the best judges of these matters, maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means, and it is a favorite story often told round the winter evening fire.